The rain over Weatherfield had a relentless, metallic weight to it, slicking the cobblestones into mirrors that fractured the amber glow of the street lamps. Inside the claustrophobic walls of the underworld factory office, Sarah Platt could hear nothing but the frantic, uneven rhythm of her own breathing. Her fingers, slick with nervous sweat, clutched a crumpled handful of documents she had unearthed from the bottom drawer of the desk, records that laid bare a web of deception far worse than anything she had imagined. Outside, the world moved with its usual mundane predictability, but within this small, dimly lit space, her entire reality had just collapsed. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to find safety, to put as much distance as possible between herself and the truth she had uncovered, yet her limbs felt heavy and unresponsive. Her eyes darted toward the door, half expecting it to burst open at any moment, revealing the very person she was desperately trying to avoid. She knew that if she stayed even a few seconds longer, the opportunity to escape would slip away entirely, leaving her trapped in a nightmare from which there would be no awakening. With a sudden surge of adrenaline, she shoved the documents into her bag, zipped it shut with a harsh metallic scrape, and bolted toward the exit, her boots clicking loudly against the concrete floor before she burst out into the torrential downpour. The transition from the relative silence of the factory to the violent assault of the storm was jarring, the cold water instantly drenching her hair and stinging her eyes as she sprinted blindly down the alley. She didn't have a clear plan, only the singular, consuming urge to get away before her presence was detected or her flight intercepted. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird, each breath drawing in the damp, petrol-scented air of the backstreets. The familiar landmarks of Coronation Street blurred past her in a haze of gray and neon, the Rover's Return, the corner shop, the terraced houses all losing their comfort and transforming into a gauntlet she had to survive. She reached into her pocket, her trembling hand finally wrapping around her mobile phone, and she began frantically pressing the screen to dial emergency services. The device felt impossibly slick in her wet hands, the touch screen misregistering her commands as water droplets confused the sensor. She swore under her breath, a sob catching in her throat, as she forced her eyes downward to focus on the glowing panel, desperately trying to initiate the call that would bring help. It was this split second of distraction, this brief but fatal lapse in situational awareness, that changed everything. She stepped off the curb and onto the main road, completely oblivious to the approaching headlights that cut through the darkness like twin blades. The heavy, low rumble of a delivery van's engine was masked by the roaring wind and the rushing sound of her own blood pumping in her ears. When she finally looked up, it was because the sudden, intense glare of light illuminated the individual raindrops around her into brilliant, blinding crystals. Time seemed to dilate, slowing to a crawl as she froze in the center of the lane, her mind unable to process the immediate proximity of the massive metal grille hurtling toward her. The tires of the van shrieked against the wet tarmac, a desperate, futile attempt by the driver to find traction on the slick surface, but the momentum was too great. Sarah stared into the light, completely paralyzed by a primitive, overwhelming terror, her phone slipping from her fingers and clattering onto the asphalt. In that agonizing fraction of a second, the certainty of a violent impact was absolute, and she braced herself for the collision that would surely end her life. Then came the sudden, violent intervention of another body. From the shadows of the pavement, Gary Windass had been watching her flee, his own desperation matching hers as he realized what she had discovered. Seeing her step directly into the path of destruction, any thoughts of self-preservation or concealment vanished from his mind, replaced by a pure, instinctive drive to protect her. He launched himself forward across the wet asphalt, his boots skidding as he covered the distance between them in a desperate, lunging stride. He reached her just as the front bumper of the van began to dip from the force of the braking, his arms wrapping around her waist with crushing force to throw her clear of the vehicle's trajectory. The impact of Gary's tackle sent Sarah flying through the air, her body twisting violently before she slammed into the hard, unforgiving surface of the cobblestones several feet away. She rolled over the wet stones, the breath knocked completely from her lungs, her skin scraped and bleeding where it hit the ground, but she was alive. The van, however, could not stop in time to avoid the man who had just taken her place. There was a sickening, dull thud as the heavy bumper collided with Gary's frame, lifting him off his feet and throwing him onto the hood before the vehicle finally ground to a halt. His body slid off the metal and crumpled onto the dark, rain-soaked road, completely motionless. The driver of the van, white-faced and shaking, threw open his door and stumbled out into the rain, shouting in panic as the sound of the horn echoed continuously through the street, jammed by the force of the sudden stop. Sarah lay on her side, gasping for air, her vision swimming as she tried to comprehend the chaotic scene. The loud, persistent blare of the horn cut through the storm, a mechanical wail that signaled the end of her escape and the beginning of a devastating aftermath. This dramatic sequence marks the turning point of the storyline, capturing the high-stakes tension of the encounter. For a deeper look into the aftermath of this incident, you can watch the Coronation Street Sarah Gets Run Over video, which illustrates the intense cinematography and emotional weight of the scene as the characters navigate the immediate fallout of the crash. The piercing wail of the delivery van's horn continued to slice through the heavy downpour, acting as a grim siren that immediately drew the residents of Coronation Street out from the warmth of their terraced homes. Doors flew open along the terrace, casting long rectangles of yellow light onto the wet pavement as neighbors peered out into the darkness, trying to make sense of the sudden chaos. Within moments, the quiet backstreet was transformed into a frantic scene of confusion and panic. Voices shouted over the roar of the wind and the hiss of the rain against the hot engine. Sarah lay shivering on the cold cobblestones, her mind a chaotic blur of shock and adrenaline as she looked past the blinding glare of the headlights toward the crumpled form of Gary Windass. The reality of what had just occurred began to pierce through her initial numbness, the horrifying realization that the man she had been running from, the man whose darkest secrets she had just uncovered, had thrown himself directly into harm's way to ensure her survival. Carla Connor was among the first to reach the scene, her coat thrown hastily over her shoulders as she sprinted from the direction of the factory, her face pale with dread. She immediately knelt beside Sarah, her hands steadying her colleague's trembling shoulders while calling out for someone to contact emergency services. Within seconds, other familiar faces populated the perimeter of the crash site, their expressions a mix of disbelief and horror as they took in the sight of the delivery van and the motionless body lying further down the asphalt. The driver of the van paced frantically, his hands clasped over his head as he repeatedly insisted to anyone who would listen that he hadn't seen her step off the curb, that the slick road had made it impossible to stop in time. The ambient noise of the street seemed to fade into a dull, low-frequency hum in Sarah's ears, overshadowed by the intense focus she placed on Gary's still chest, desperately searching for any sign of movement or life beneath the rain-soaked fabric of his jacket. The arrival of the paramedics was signaled by the distant, ascending chime of sirens that gradually grew louder until the flashing blue lights illuminated the entire street in a rhythmic, surreal pulse. The emergency responders moved with practiced efficiency, pushing through the gathering crowd to establish a perimeter around the two casualties. As a technician began assessing Sarah for potential spinal injuries and concussions, a larger team converged on Gary, immediately stabilizing his neck and preparing a backboard. Sarah tried to push herself up, her voice a cracked whisper as she attempted to tell the paramedics what had happened, but the shock had taken a firm hold of her body, rendering her speech fragmented and her movements uncoordinated. She watched through a veil of tears and rain as they lifted Gary onto the stretcher, his face bruised and tracked with blood, his eyes closed to the world. The documents she had stolen from the office lay forgotten in her waterlogged bag, a ticking time bomb of information that now felt secondary to the immediate, fragile boundary between life and death playing out on the tarmac. As both ambulances sped away toward the hospital, their sirens fading into the Manchester night, the street was left in a state of stunned silence, the remaining residents gathering in small clusters to whisper about the relationship between the two victims and the events leading up to the collision. At the hospital, the atmosphere was thick with clinical urgency, the bright fluorescent lights contrasting sharply with the dark, stormy night they had just escaped. Sarah was wheeled into a cubicle for observation, her physical injuries categorized as minor scrapes and severe bruising, but her psychological state remained profoundly fractured. Every time she closed her eyes, she was forced to relive the split second where the headlights filled her vision, followed immediately by the force of Gary's body displacing hers. The burden of the secret she carried, the knowledge of Gary's involvement in the disappearance of Rick Nalon, coupled with the profound debt of her own life, created an unbearable conflict within her. She knew that the police would soon want a statement about the sequence of events, and she was utterly unequipped to decide whether to protect the man who had just saved her or to deliver the truth that would destroy him completely.